On Saturday mornings along 14th Street in Manhattan, the air smelled like olive oil and garlic before the sun cleared the rooftops. That stretch between 7th and 8th Avenue earned the name Little Spain because the people who lived there cooked the way they had always cooked, with whatever the ships brought in and whatever the neighbors could share. Number 19 on this list cost almost nothing but fed an entire boarding house. The ninth dish here traveled 3,000 miles, from the green interior of Asturias to a coal stove in Chelsea. And number 5 on this list required a patience most American cooks had never seen. These were not restaurant dishes. They were the meals Spanish families stretched across long winters in a city that did not yet know their names. So hit subscribe because here are 25 foods Spanish immigrants cooked in 1920s, Little Spain, New York City. Number 25. Pan con tomate. The simplest breakfast in Little Spain started with stale bread. A thick slice of yesterday's loaf, toasted over a gas burner until the edges turned brown and brittle. Then a ripe tomato cut in half, rubbed across the surface until the bread soaked up the juice and the pulp. A thread of olive oil on top. A pinch of salt. That was it. Boarding house workers on 14th Street ate this before dawn, standing over the sink because nobody had time to sit down. The bread was never fresh. Fresh bread cost money. Day-old bread was free or close to it, and rubbing tomato into it softened the crumb and gave it flavor. In a kitchen shared by 4 families, this was the one dish that needed no stove, no pot, and no argument about who used the burner last. Number 24. Pimientos de padrón. A handful of small green peppers thrown into a smoking pan with olive oil and coarse salt. That was the entire recipe. The peppers came from Galicia, and the Galicians who settled along the west side of Manhattan brought seeds with them. By the 1920s, a few families grew them in window boxes and shared them with neighbors when the harvest came in. The trick was that most of them tasted mild, almost sweet, but one in every handful was blisteringly hot. Nobody knew which one until they bit into it. At a weekend gathering in somebody's flat, a plate of these peppers was the first thing on the table and the last thing cleared. They cost nothing. They needed nothing but heat and salt. And they turned a glass of cheap red wine into something worth sitting down for. Number 23. Sardinas a la plancha. The smell of grilled sardines on a Saturday afternoon could travel 4 floors and out into the street. Spanish families bought them fresh from the Fulton Fish Market, and a man with a pushcart walked the block selling them by the dozen for a few cents. They were gutted with a thumb, laid flat on a screaming hot griddle, and cooked with nothing but salt and a squeeze of lemon. The skin blistered and crackled. The flesh stayed oily and soft. Every Spaniard in the neighborhood knew the sound of that skin hitting the iron, and every American neighbor knew the smell. Some complained. The Spanish did not care. This was how sardines were eaten in Galicia and Andalusia and Cantabria, and this was how they would be eaten on 14th Street. The griddle was the same. Only the ocean was different. Number 22. Migas. Stale bread torn into pieces, soaked in water, squeezed dry, and fried in olive oil with garlic and whatever scraps were on hand. In Spain, shepherds carried migas across mountains because the ingredients weighed nothing and lasted forever. In Manhattan, factory workers carried the same instinct into rented rooms. A day-old loaf, a clove of garlic, a splash of oil saved in a tin can. Some added bits of chorizo, others cracked an egg on top. The point was never elegance. The point was turning something nobody wanted into something everybody ate. Migas did not appear on any restaurant menu in New York. It appeared on kitchen tables in walk-up apartments where the rent was due and the paycheck had not arrived. Number 21. Chorizo a la sidra. The Asturians in the neighborhood made this on cold nights. Chorizo sliced thick and browned in a pan, then doused with hard apple cider until the liquid reduced into a dark, sticky glaze. The cider came from home, or from the Basque importers who ran small shops on the side streets near 14th. The combination smelled like smoke and apples and paprika all at once. In Asturias, cider was poured from high above the glass to aerate it, and they did the same thing here in small kitchens with low ceilings and splattered walls. The chorizo was never the soft kind. It was cured, dense, and loaded with smoked pimenton. A man could eat half a link with a piece of bread and call it supper and mean it. Number 20. Empanada gallega. This was the Sunday meal that Galician women assembled on a floured counter in the back of a kitchen while everybody else sat in the front room arguing about wages. The dough was wheat flour, olive oil, and warm water, rolled thin and stretched by hand over a baking sheet. The filling changed with the season and the budget. Tuna and onion when the cans were cheap, salt cod and raisins during Lent, pork loin with roasted peppers when somebody had money. The top crust was sealed with a fork, brushed with egg, and baked until it turned golden and the filling bubbled through the fork holes. What made the empanada different from anything else in the neighborhood was its portability. A woman could bake it Sunday morning, wrap the slices in wax paper, and send them with her husband to the factory floor on Monday. It traveled cold. It tasted good cold. It did not need a plate or a fork. The Galician boarding houses on 15th Street served it at midday, and the men who ate it stood in the hallway and ate with one hand and wiped the crumbs off their shirts with the other. By the end of the decade, a few Galician women sold empanada slices out of their apartments for 10 cents apiece. The neighbors came because nobody in Little Spain made a crust that thin and that strong at the same time. The recipe was never written down. It moved from mother to daughter by feel, by the weight of the dough in the hand, by the sound it made when it hit the counter. Number 19. Patatas bravas. There was a boarding house on Cherry Street where a widow from Valladolid rented rooms to cigar workers from Galicia and dock laborers from Cadiz. She cooked one meal a day for all of them, and 3 nights a week it was bravas. She cut the potatoes into rough chunks, fried them in olive oil until the edges cracked and turned the color of old brick, and piled them onto a single clay platter in the center of the table. The sauce was hers alone. Dried guindilla peppers ground in a mortar, a spoonful of pimenton, vinegar, and canned tomato cooked down until it clung to a spoon. Every man at the table ate from the same plate. Nobody asked for seconds, because there were no seconds. The heat from the sauce was not sharp. It sat at the back of the throat and made the next piece of potato feel like a reward. A plate of bravas cost her 11 cents to make for 8 men, and not one of them ever moved out. Number 18. Pisto manchego. Tomatoes, peppers, zucchini, and onion, all diced and slow-cooked in olive oil until they collapsed into a thick, soft stew. This was the garden dish of La Mancha, and it arrived in Little Spain with families from the plains south of Madrid. In the summer, when the pushcart vendors on 8th Avenue sold tomatoes and peppers cheap, a woman could make a pot of pisto that lasted 3 days. Some served it with a fried egg on top. Others spooned it over bread. The flavor was sweet and smoky and patient. You could not make pisto in 20 minutes. It needed an hour of stirring and watching and adjusting the flame. That slowness was the point. It tasted like a kitchen where somebody had time and cared enough to use it. There is a thing about immigrant cooking that outsiders get wrong. They see the simplicity and call it poverty food. They see the repetition and call it limitation. But the Spanish families who cooked in those small kitchens on 14th Street were not cooking out of desperation. They were cooking out of certainty. They knew exactly what these dishes needed, and they knew exactly what they did not need. Every ingredient that was left out on purpose. Number 17. Croquetas de jamón. Flour and butter cooked into a paste, then thinned with milk and stirred over low heat until the mixture thickened into a dense bechamel. Scraps of cured ham folded in. The whole thing chilled until firm enough to roll into small cylinders, dredged in egg and breadcrumbs, and fried until the outside was dark gold and shattered on the first bite. Inside, the filling was molten and salty and rich. In Madrid, these were bar snacks, but in Little Spain they stretched a few ounces of expensive ham across an entire family. One small end of a Jamin Serrano leg could make 30 croquetas if the bechamel was generous. Women shaped them by the dozen, lined them up on trays, and fried them in batches. The children waited by the stove because there was no better sound in that kitchen than the crackle of a fresh croqueta hitting hot oil. Number 16. Escalivada. Eggplant and red peppers roasted directly over the gas flame until the skin blackened, and the flesh underneath turned soft and smoky. Peeled, torn into strips, dressed with olive oil and salt. That was all. Catalan families in the neighborhood made escalivada when the weather turned warm, and nobody wanted to stand over a pot of stew. It was served cold on a plate, sometimes with anchovies draped over the top, sometimes with nothing at all. The word came from the Catalan verb for cooking in embers, and even on a gas stove in Manhattan, the principle held, "Let the fire do the work. Let the smoke get into the flesh. Do not add anything the vegetable did not ask for." Number 15. Albondigas and salsa, meatballs the size of a walnut, made from whatever ground meat was cheapest that week, mixed with soaked bread, garlic, parsley, and an egg, rolled by hand, browned in a pan, then dropped into a sauce of tomato and onion and left to simmer until the meatballs absorbed the flavor and the sauce thickened around them. Every Spanish mother in Little Spain had her own version. Some used pork. Some mixed pork and beef. A few put a pinch of cinnamon in the meat, a Moorish tradition that had survived 5 centuries without anybody knowing why. The sauce was always slow. The meatballs were always small, and there were never enough. A plate of albondigas set on the table disappeared before anybody could argue about who got the last one. Number 14. Callos a la madrilena. Tripe, slow-cooked with chickpeas, blood sausage, chorizo, and a thick sauce made from tomato, onion, and smoked paprika. This was the dish that divided Little Spain down the middle. The people from Madrid loved it, the Galicians tolerated it, and anyone who walked past the kitchen door while it was cooking either came inside or crossed the street. The tripe required hours of preparation. It was scrubbed, boiled, scrubbed again, boiled again, and cut into squares the size of postage stamps. The smell during the cleaning was strong enough to fill a hallway. But after 4 hours of simmering with the chickpeas and the chorizo and the paprika, that smell transformed into something deep and warm and savory. The morcilla broke apart in the stew and darkened the broth. Callos was a winter dish in Madrid, served in ceramic bowls in tabernas near the Plaza Mayor. In Little Spain, it was served in chipped bowls in railroad apartments on 15th Street. The recipe did not change. The setting changed. The people who ate it still burned their tongues on the first bite because nobody waited for callos to cool down. You ate it hot, or you ate somebody else's portion. By the time the decade ended, the butchers on 9th Avenue knew exactly which Spanish customers would come in asking for honeycomb tripe on Friday afternoon. They saved it because nobody else wanted it. The Spanish paid almost nothing for it and turned it into the richest, slowest, most uncompromising dish in the neighborhood. Number 13. Gambas al ajillo. Shrimp sizzling in a shallow clay dish with sliced garlic and a dried red pepper, the oil bubbling and popping and filling the room with a smell that made everyone stop talking. The garlic had to cook fast. The shrimp had to cook faster, and the whole thing had to arrive at the table while the oil was still moving. In Little Spain, the shrimp came from the Fulton Market, and the clay dishes came from import shops on the same block that sold olive oil in tins and paprika in burlap sacks. A man could make this in 4 minutes if he knew what he was doing. If he did not, he burned the garlic and ruined everything. There was no recovery, there was no middle ground. Number 12. Lentejas con chorizo. Brown lentils simmered with onion, carrot, potato, a bay leaf, and half a chorizo split down the middle so the fat and paprika bled into the broth. This was the cheapest hot meal in Little Spain and possibly the best. A pound of dried lentils cost a few pennies and fed 6 people. The chorizo gave it color and flavor. The potato gave it weight. The pot sat on the back burner while a woman did 3 other things, and when it was done, it needed nothing else. No bread on the side, no salad, no garnish. Just a bowl and a spoon. In Spain, there is a saying that lentils are the meat of the poor. In Little Spain, that was not an insult. It was a fact that kept families fed when the factory hours got cut. Number 11. Arroz con pollo. Rice cooked with chicken, saffron, green peas, and red pepper in a wide, shallow pan. This was not the Cuban version, and it was not the Puerto Rican version, although those existed on nearby blocks. The Spanish version was drier, the grains separate and golden from the saffron, the chicken browned first and then buried under the rice to cook through. Saffron was expensive even then, but Spanish families bought it in tiny paper envelopes from the import shops on 14th Street and used it thread by thread. The color it gave the rice was worth the cost. A pot of arroz con pollo on a Sunday table turned a rented kitchen into something that felt permanent. The smell alone could convince a man that he was not 3,000 miles from home. Number 10. Pimientos rellenos. Red peppers stuffed with a mixture of ground meat, rice, and tomato, baked in the oven until the peppers softened and the filling set firm. In the Basque country and Navarra, this was a common weeknight supper, and the Basque families in Little Spain kept the tradition. The peppers were never the small kind. They were large, thick-walled pimientos del piquillo if the import shops had them, or ordinary bell peppers if they did not. The filling stretched a half-pound of meat across 4 servings, which was the real point. The oven did the work. The cook did the stuffing and the waiting. The smell was warm and faintly sweet, and it crept through the walls into the neighbor's apartment, which was either an invitation or a provocation, depending on who lived next door. Number 9. Fabada asturiana. Before anything else, there were the beans. Fabs de la Granja, white and broad and heavy, shipped from the green interior of Asturias in burlap sacks that still smelled like damp Spanish soil when they arrived at the docks on the west side of Manhattan. Nothing sold in an American grocery store came close. Navy beans were small and chalky. These were the size of a man's thumbnail, and when you pressed one between your fingers, it gave like butter. The Asturian cooks in Little Spain soaked them from sundown to sunrise, then set them over low heat with morcilla, chorizo, salt pork, and a few threads of saffron. The pot was never stirred. That was the rule nobody wrote down. You shook it gently, side to side, because dragging a spoon through those beans would split them open and ruin the broth. A broken bean was a confession of impatience. Hours passed. The fat from the pork and the blood sausage rose and gave the surface a copper sheen that looked like it belonged in a painting, not a tenement kitchen. When it was ready, the broth was so dense it held a wooden spoon upright. You ate it from a deep bowl with a piece of bread torn from the loaf, nothing else on the table, nothing else needed. On a February night, when the wind came screaming down from the George Washington Bridge and the windows in those old railroad apartments rattled in their frames, one bowl of fabada turned a cold room into a warm country. The beans had crossed 3,000 miles of ocean, and they arrived tasting exactly as they tasted in a stone farmhouse outside Oviedo. That was not luck. That was a recipe carried in the memory of women who never once measured a thing. The American grocery stores of the 1920s did not carry most of what these families needed. No pimenton, no saffron, no dried salt cod hanging from a hook, no cured chorizo the color of dried blood. So the Spanish importers on 14th Street became lifelines. They stocked what nobody else stocked, and their shops smelled like Spain the moment you walked through the door. Olive oil in tins, olives in barrels, paprika in metal boxes with faded labels from Extremadura. Number 8. Gazpacho. Cold soup made from ripe tomatoes, stale bread, garlic, olive oil, vinegar, and water, all pounded together and served in a glass or a bowl in the middle of summer. The bread thickened it. The vinegar sharpened it. The olive oil made it smooth. In Andalusia, field workers drank gazpacho the way Americans drank water, and the Andalusians in Little Spain kept the habit when the July heat turned their apartments into ovens. There was no blender in the 1920s. The tomatoes and bread and garlic went into a mortar and were crushed by hand until the mixture turned thick and pink and cold. Neighbors who had never seen cold soup watched the Spanish drink it from glasses and did not understand. The Spanish did not explain. They just poured another glass. Number 7. Potaje de garbanzos, chickpeas simmered with spinach, salt cod, and a hard-boiled egg, all in a broth flavored with garlic, cumin, and a bay leaf. This was the Friday meal in Catholic Spanish households, the one day the meat stayed in the icebox and the salt cod came out. The chickpeas were soaked the night before, and by Friday afternoon they were soft and earthy and holding together a stew that tasted richer than it had any right to. The spinach wilted into the broth and turned it green. The cod broke apart into white flakes. The egg was quartered and placed on top, and it was not decoration. It was protein. Every ingredient in this dish had a job, and none of them were there to look pretty. Number 6. Pulpo a la gallega. Octopus boiled until tender, sliced with scissors, arranged on a wooden plate, and dressed with olive oil, coarse salt, and a heavy dusting of smoked paprika. The Galicians called it pulpo a fera because they served it at village fairs, and in Little Spain they served it the same way, on round wooden boards, at gatherings that smelled like wine and tobacco. The octopus came from the Fulton market or from Galician fishermen who worked the boats off the coast. Cooking it right meant knowing when to stop. Too short, and the flesh was rubber. Too long, and it fell apart. The women who made it pressed a wooden spoon against the thickest tentacle and judged the resistance. When the spoon sank in just enough, the octopus came out. That judgment could not be taught from a page. Number 5. Bacalao al pil pil. Salt cod soaked for 2 days in cold water. Changed 3 times until the salt released and the flesh turned white and firm. Then placed skin side down in a clay pot with olive oil and sliced garlic over the lowest possible flame. What happened next was the reason this dish existed and the reason most people failed at it. As the cod cooked, the gelatin from the skin began to leach into the oil. The cook moved the pot in slow circles, swirling the oil, coaxing the gelatin and the fat to bind into an emulsion. No flour, no cream, no thickener of any kind. Just patience and wrist movement and the natural collagen of the fish turning hot oil into a pale, silky sauce that clung to the cod like a second skin. The Basque families in Little Spain made this on special occasions because it demanded attention and good cod, which was not always available. The salt cod had to be the right thickness. Too thin and the emulsion broke. Too thick and the inside stayed raw while the outside overcooked. A woman who could make pil-pil was respected in the neighborhood the way a man who could lay bricks straight was respected on a job site. The skill was visible. The result was proof. Most American cooks in the 1920s had never seen a sauce made from nothing but oil and fish gelatin. They would not see one for another 70 years until restaurant chefs started calling it molecular gastronomy and charging $40 a plate for what a Basque grandmother made with a piece of dried fish and an hour she was not in a hurry to finish. None of these recipes came from cookbooks. They came from memory and repetition and the weight of a mother's hand on a daughter's hand, showing her how hard to press the dough or how fast to stir the sauce. The kitchens in Little Spain were small and loud and crowded, and the cooking that happened in them was not written down until most of the people who did it were gone. Number 4. Churros con chocolate. Dough piped through a star-shaped nozzle into hot oil, fried until golden and ridged and crispy, then dipped into a cup of thick hot chocolate so dense a spoon could stand in it. In Madrid, churrerias opened before dawn, and the smell of frying dough pulled people off the streets at 5 in the morning. In Little Spain, a few families made churros on weekend mornings for the block, using a hand press and a deep pot of oil on the stove. The chocolate was not the sweet American kind. It was dark and bitter and thickened with cornstarch until it had the texture of pudding. The churro was the vehicle. The chocolate was the destination. Children ate them as fast as they came out of the oil, burning their fingers and not caring. Adults dunked slower and talked about the week and let the morning take its time. Number 3. Tortilla espanola. Potatoes sliced thin and fried slowly in olive oil until soft but not brown, then mixed with beaten eggs and poured back into the pan. Cooked on one side, flipped onto a plate, slid back in, cooked on the other. The result was a thick, golden cake with layers of tender potato held together by barely set egg. Every Spanish household in Little Spain made tortilla. It was breakfast and lunch and supper, and the thing you brought to a neighbor's door when somebody was sick or somebody had died. A cold wedge of tortilla between two pieces of bread was the most portable meal in the neighborhood. Factory workers carried it wrapped in paper. Children ate it after school. It sat on the counter at room temperature for hours and only got better. The eggs and potatoes became something that was more than either one alone. And if it was the taste of your childhood, you already know there is no way to describe what that means to someone who did not. Number 2. Cocido madrileño, a single pot containing chickpeas, beef shank, pork belly, chorizo, morcilla, cabbage, potato, carrot, and a marrow bone, cooked low and slow for hours until the broth turned golden and every ingredient had given something to every other ingredient. In Madrid, cocido was served in 3 courses called vuelcos. First, the broth, strained and poured into cups. Then the chickpeas and vegetables. Then the meats, sliced and arranged on a platter. In Little Spain, the ceremony was the same even when the table was a door laid across 2 sawhorses and the guests were 6 men who had worked a 12-hour shift at the garment factory on 23rd Street. The cocido took all day to cook and 20 minutes to eat, and nobody spoke while they ate it because there was nothing to say that the food was not already saying. Number 1. Paella Valenciana. Rice cooked in a wide, shallow pan over a high flame with saffron, chicken, rabbit, green beans, broad beans, and snails when they could be found. In Valencia, paella was cooked outdoors over a wood fire, and the best part was the socarrat, the crust of caramelized rice that formed at the bottom of the pan. In Little Spain, the fire was a gas burner and the pan sat on a grate, but the cook still listened for the sound of the rice beginning to crackle. When she heard it, she pulled the pan off the heat and waited. That wait was not patience. It was faith. Faith that the rice would hold. Faith that the crust would form. Faith that the dish her grandmother taught her to make on a dirt floor in a village outside Valencia would taste exactly the same in a rented kitchen on 14th Street in Manhattan. It did. That pot of rice was not supper. It was proof that 3,000 miles of ocean could not change what a family knew how to cook. Those 25 dishes did not survive because somebody published a cookbook. They survived because the people who made them refused to stop. If any of these were ever on your family's table, you already know what that kitchen smelled like. And if you did not, now you do. If any of these dishes belong to your family, tell us which one in the comments.